This release from Columbia Records in 1938, featuring a cover design by the company's art director Alex Steinweiss, is generally considered to be the first long-playing record, even if in reality it was a box set of separate 78 RPM discs which had to be played sequentially. And although this first design was photographic, most of those that followed were illustrated designs created in a firmly modernist, quite dispassionate style with integrated typography. But it wasn't until a decade later in 1948 that the first successful example of a 33 1/3 long-playing record featuring this barely illustrated cover design by Steinweiss was released. And all long-playing records that followed in its wake were produced using the slim cardboard packaging format he had also created. It was around this time that he hired an assistant designer in the form of Jim Flora, whose graphic outlook was similar to his own, although far more radically modernist. And his cubist-influenced and sometimes misleadingly manic images were used for the packaging of quite a few albums by jazz performers in the post-war years. In the early 50s, Flora left Columbia to concentrate more on children's bookwork, but by this point many more art directors, designers and illustrators had also been attracted to this new platform for their work. George Mass was one of the more prominent of these, and he created many attractive covers for classical albums released by Mercury Records, using a semi-abstracted modernist approach which combined figurative elements with brightly coloured purely decorative shapes in a manner not totally dissimilar to that of Steinweiss. But not everyone was pursuing such geometric designs, and Burt Goldblatt's compelling illustrations for a large volume of jazz albums were significantly more naturalistic, using exceptionally expressive calligraphic pen and ink drawings combined with overprinted blocks of limited colour. His illustrations were invariably of the musicians themselves, and the result was an uncanny and strikingly human visual evocation of the music they created. David Stone Martin also started designing cover illustrations in the early 1950s, and he was equally imaginative and expressive in the images he produced. He was also a conspicuously versatile stylist, and he could slip readily into the more wacky abstracted territory of Jim Flora. But in the main, similar to Goldblatt, he gained a reputation for the more evocative drawings he created of the various performers, including this emotionally charged cover for the singer Billie Holiday. By this time there were many others attracted to the illustration of album covers, and there was certainly an element of bandwagon jumping taking place, with illustrators such as Bob Jones, Jerry Gersten and Abner Graboff producing semi-abstracted cartoonish results along similar lines to the pioneering modernist work of Jim Flora. There were very few female illustrators working in this arena, but both Gloria Grattan and Paula Donahue were noteworthy exceptions to the rule, even if neither proved to be particularly enduring. And it was also at this time that a young Andy Warhol produced several similarly styled covers for jazz albums, most of which were produced for the respected Blue Note label, before going on to reinvent himself as a wildly successful pop artist some years later. The second half of the 1950s saw the rise of rock and roll, but along with the less energetic, romantic pop and easy listening music of the period, the genre totally ignored the potential of illustration in favour of unimaginative, retouched portrait photography of the performers. So it continued to be the more commercially sidelined musical genres such as blues and jazz, which attracted the more expressive use of illustration to package their product, with more compelling examples from David Stone Martin and Burt Goldblatt. And relative newcomer Milton Glaser also gained a solid early reputation with a collection of brightly coloured evocative covers for a series of jazz compilations issued in the early 60s. But even in jazz and blues, typographic and photographic covers such as the highly influential designs of Reed Miles for the Blue Note label were also becoming dominant. And when a new generation of pop and rock performers appeared in the early 60s, led by the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan and a host of others, their record labels continued to favour the use of photography, even if some of it at least was a bit more imaginative than what had gone before. But that changed forever in the summer of 1966 with the release of the Beatles' Revolver album and a cover illustrated by Klaus Voormann, which combined elements of crudely cut out photo montage and a Beardsley influenced line drawing of the band members rendered in black and white. This release quickly led to others on both sides of the Atlantic following suit, with more illustrated covers in a dazzling variety of styles and imagery, some of which didn't even feature the band or performer. And it was at this point that the word psychedelic began to be used in reference to some of the music and the illustrations created to package it. It was also the beginning of the fairly widespread use of visual piracy, such as the Hindu-style cover of Jimi Hendrix's second album. The first significant evidence of a particular illustrator being linked to a particular band came with Martin Sharp's work for Cream. Disraeli Gears did feature manipulated photos of the band members, but it was dominated by Sharp's psychedelic doodles. And although the following year's Wheels of Fire, printed on silvered board, wasn't the first double album with a gatefold sleeve, it was certainly one of the most memorable. Among other innovative covers of the time, Robert Crumb's comic strip style cover for Big Brother and the Holding Company's Cheap Thrills made a significant impact and is still considered iconic by many. It was in the later 1960s that an enduring connection was made between the illustrator Phil Travers and the Moody Blues, who by this time had evolved from their beat group origins into something altogether more symphonic. And Travers created several suitably atmospheric, quasi-mystical painted works for the band in fairly rapid succession. But most of the covers continued to be created on a one-off basis, and quite a few others from the later 1960s, such as Rick Griffin's mind-bending folk art influenced cover and trademark unreadable lettering for the Grateful Dead, and Lee Conklin's cross-hatched optical illusion for Santana, were considered instant graphic classics by fans of rock music. And there were a large number of other albums released by a seemingly endless parade of British and American bands, which harnessed a wide range of styles on their covers. Mother Hoople memorably used a colorised original by the Dutch artist M.C. Escher, who was actually credited, and Barry Godber's deeply unsettling gatefold sleeve for King Crimson were both unforgettable demonstrations of the potency and symbiosis of illustration and music. By the time the 1960s ended, the use of illustration on rock album covers was widespread. But blues music, and to a lesser extent jazz, had also been embraced by the more eclectic rock fans, and both genres continued to provide notable examples of cover art, such as Milton Glazer's electrically charged covers for Lightning Hopkins, and Tom Wilson's pencil and watercolour front and back cover evocation of the famous Robert Johnson hotel room recording sessions. In the early 70s, a slightly younger generation of illustrators became linked to the increasing longer form and frequently more self-indulgent music being made. And German illustrator Abdul Mati Klarwein had a run of significant successes with his complex and highly distinctive surrealist pictorial approach, which featured on visually engrossing covers for albums by Santana and jazz artist Miles Davis, among others. But easily the most iconic and enduring illustrator of the period was Roger Dean. Although he had actually made his album debut as early as 1968 with this cover for the band Gun, it was the early 1970s and beyond that he had greater success with the fantasy-based images he created for a whole host of emerging bands, all of which chimed perfectly with the increasingly progressive, complex nature of the music and a tangible rise in the popularity of fantasy art in general. Most significantly, it was his inextricable association with the progressive rock band Yes, for which he became most admired. and both the band and Dean benefited greatly from their symbiotic relationship for quite a few years to come. But although Dean is widely regarded as the illustrator who defined our collective memory of 1970s rock album covers, there were quite a few others who were just as prolific, if not as well known or widely admired. In the USA, Martin Muller, who worked under the fanciful alias Neon Park III, had made his debut in 1970 with the unforgettably grotesque cover for Frank Zappa's Weasels Rip My Flesh. But in 1972 he created the cover for the album Sailing Shoes, the second by Little Feat, and this turned into one of the most enduring associations between a particular band and illustrator. All the records they released in the decade featured his frequently disturbing paintings, which blended pop art and surrealism in equal measure, using a distinctively daub painting technique, a mild obsession with ducks, and the occasional incorporation of graphic elements pasted in from other sources. Rick Griffin was also still closely associated with rock music, and he created covers for a wide range of bands, including a return to the Grateful Dead and two spectacularly evocative maritime-themed covers for the now-forgotten Mustard Seed Faith and the equally neglected Robert Hunter. But Griffin's original cover for the Welsh rock band Man hit problems when the first design, featuring Mads Alfred E. Newman, had to be reimagined as this close-up view to avoid potential copyright problems. By this point, the graphic diversity, which had started in the middle of the 60s, had led to a complete free-for-all, with the whimsical watercolours of John Byrne, better known as Patrick, vying for the buyer's attention, alongside the more graphically formal but still psychedelic designs of Colin Fulcher, working under the alias Barney Bubbles. Other bands, such as Pure Prairie League, legitimately reused the original artwork of Roman Rockwell, and Genesis similarly repurposed this image from the veteran artist and designer Betty Swanick. It was also in the early and mid-1970s that Drew Struzan, who would become better known for his movie poster work, also appeared on several album covers. He was particularly adept at channeling the stylistic approach of Joseph Leyendecker, which he used on several occasions, sometimes sailing perilously close to what might legitimately be considered piracy rather than mere influence. By this point, Robert Crumb had moved on from his earlier rock music debut to create cover illustrations for blues and ragtime music, using his 1920s comic book-derived styling, frequently featuring comic depictions of black characters some found offensively generic. The mid-1970s witnessed a diversity of approaches, which made a trip to your friendly neighbourhood record store as much a feast for the eyes as it was for the ears, with the work of any number of distinctive and talented illustrators vying for your attention. And this relatively fierce competition led to a considerable volume of generally highly rendered illustrated covers being generated, which could arguably be considered to be a true golden age for this particular area of visual expression, even more so than those created in the second half of the 1960s. Punk rock appeared in 1976, but the bands generally favoured photography on their covers, other than very rare exceptions such as this Kandinsky-inspired cover by Barney Bubbles for the Damned's second album. And it was even more the case with other genres such as disco and funk. But other than the exception that was punk, it was the various strands of rock music, whether heavy or more melodic, which continued to be the true home of the illustrated cover. And among other memorable covers of the period, the work of established and respected fantasy artists became a dominant feature. Frank Kelly Freas was persuaded to make alterations to his earlier pulp cover for the Queen album News of the World. And in the later 1970s, the band Molly Hatchet made particularly memorable use of the dynamic and highly plausible, muscle-bound imagery of the renowned fantasy artist Frank Frazetta on several of their albums. But in other contexts, Milton Glaser was still plying a highly individualistic path, and others such as Jill Mumford and Barney Bubbles found other more avant-garde ways to express themselves and swim against the prevailing tide. 1982 saw the first release of a commercial CD, and although not as big an insult to the 12-inch vinyl cover as the earlier pre-recorded cassette, The image was dramatically shrunk in the process and encased in hard plastic, losing much of its original appeal. But for now at least, the vinyl record album continued to be the format of choice for many. From the early 80s onwards, it was undoubtedly the harder end of rock which most frequently harnessed the power of fantasy-based images. Britain's Iron Maiden commissioned their cover illustrations from Derek Riggs, who created gleeful horror-based imagery, with the skeletal character known as Eddie becoming an icon in his own right. And in roughly the same time frame, Doug Johnson's slick pinball-style work featured on several covers for albums by Judas Priest to great effect. Some, such as Rodney Matthews, followed in the softer fantasy footsteps of Roger Dean, and Ian McCaig's folk fantasy cover art for Jethro Tull plausibly invoked the spirit of the earlier Arthur Rackham. But it was the tougher, darker images which prevailed, and respected fantasy artist Boris Vallejo's intense hellish cover for Ozzy Osbourne and a number of similarly joyfully gruesome horror illustrations were created by Michael Whelan for various metal bands. Others, such as comic book artist Charles Burns, also favoured the grotesque, but brought their own stylistic approaches to the genre. Pop music continued almost exclusively to ignore illustration, although Michael Jackson's 1991 album Dangerous very unusually but memorably used the surreal work of Mark Ryden on the cover. But in general, the 1990s undoubtedly saw further reduction in the use of illustration on album covers, and photography was more dominant than ever, particularly for mainstream pop music. There were notable exceptions, most of which continue to be for rock music and its various iterations. And to their credit, what was produced was remarkably diverse and frequently quite absorbing. But there were few, if any, that replicated the long-term associations seen in previous decades between the illustrator and the performers. It was in 1999 that the possibility of downloading music first appeared in the form of Napster, and 2 years later iTunes followed. And although it didn't happen overnight, its growth was inevitable, and you can't package something that doesn't physically exist. But surprisingly, some, such as Jamie Hewlett, whose manga-style work for Gorillaz made a welcome exception to the rule, persisted with the use of illustration into the 21st century. And as the new millennium got underway, there were other illustrators and crucially bands and performers themselves who apparently couldn't let go of the idea of the album as a physical object to be cherished. And even if both the vinyl record and even the CD were considered by most to be anachronistic, it seems the visual quality of what covers there were remained every bit as high as it had ever been. And as had been the general earlier trend in preceding decades, it was the purveyors of more challenging and for many unlistenable subgenres of heavy metal who continued to be illustration's dominant patron. And numerous fantasy-styled illustrators seem to have been only too happy to supply these bands with images which try to outdo each other in terms of their darker, somewhat nihilistic appeal. Nevertheless, as late as 2019, veteran fantasy artist Roger Dean created this less disturbing, more tranquil image for a live Yes album. Undoubtedly, the 12-inch vinyl album will never return to anything even approaching its earlier levels of popularity, and consequently the illustration of covers has sadly become a graphic equivalent of roof thatching. But I was pleasantly surprised while researching this topic to discover, among others, the work of two totally dissimilar illustrators, both of whom I find particularly interesting. Dave Van Patten has created several fascinating clinically executed doodles for a variety of performers, and the nature of his images serves as a reminder that individuality and imagination don't always rely on faithful representation. And at the other extreme, the skillfully executed surreal painted work of Dan Goldsworthy really does hark back to a time when music fans saw the cover art as an extension of the music contained on the record. And I hope they and others continue to fly the flag for illustration in this embattled arena for at least a few more years.